Van Gogh, Frida Kahlo, Picasso all sent political messaging through their art, but now it is only valued for its beauty and historical preservation. The meaning is diluted, Judge. Currently, in our status quo, we are faced with bigger problems going on, right? Poverty, climate change, which the elite patrons of art have a comfortable protection from. This type of activism that we create on our side literally creates moral discomfort, literally reminding them of these issues, making it the only way for proper activism to actually exist. So proud to propose. On the top of my speech, then, I have three crucial points for setup on proposition. Firstly, let's fully contextualize the motion here. What is the context here, Judge? In recent years, we've seen a growing trend of activists choosing to protest by damaging these high profile paintings in museums. These are not random acts of vandalism, Judge. Rather, they are literally deliberate and symbolic actions aimed at drawing attention to these urgent global crises, especially the environmental injustice and climate change. This is especially important, Judge, because you're doing it in spaces that literally represent wealth, prestige, and institutional power, right? Things like the Museum de Louvre, for example. Crucially, though, the purpose of these activists is not to destroy the art permanently, but to disrupt the complacency that is being seen in our status quo. So, by targeting these famous artworks, they ensure the media attention, the public discussion is actually being gained, right? And leading to moral discomfort, which we think is an important currency for activism. But no, Judge, when we say that these paintings should be displayed with the damage rather than being restored, we don't mean abandoning the conservation entirely. What does it look like on our side of the house? We think it looks like a few things. Number one, not immediately cleaning or erasing the damage for public display. Number two, you're preserving the artwork in its damaged state or actually delaying the restoration. Then third, it's displaying it alongside proper contextualization and explaining why the protest occurred in the first place. I think after some time, it's fair for us to say that it would be cleaned up, right? It wouldn't stay there for like tens of years. Importantly, though, many of these paintings are protected by glass, coatings, and protective layers, meaning that the damage is not permanent or irreversible. Restoration remains technically possible. The question is whether it should happen immediately or whether the damage should be preserved as part of the artwork's social history. Crucially, though, Judge, both sides must acknowledge that these actions don't go unpunished, right? In the status quo, the activists who did this actually still face legal consequences. They're still prosecuted under vandalism or like public order laws, and they are deterred through fines, and some of them even went to prison for 2 years. Therefore, supporting this motion does not mean endorsing like the lawlessness of what these individuals are doing. The rule of law still remains intact. No, Judge, what is the urgency of this debate? This debate happens in the status quo defined by climate crisis, right? Where it's literally characterized by global warming. Note that this affects everyone, but disproportionately harms the lower income and marginalized communities. Because these upper classes, who technically go to the museum, can mitigate impacts through air conditioning or reallocation or insurance and infrastructure, right? They have methods to actually not make the harms proximate to them. Meanwhile, these vulnerable communities face floods, heat waves, and food insecurity, oftentimes without a way to opt out of it. And because climate change is both urgent and unequal, the traditional polite forms of protest literally is not enough to actually create sufficient change. Secondly, though, what is the metric of this debate, Judge? Note that under this environmental motion, it's whether or not the state and its cultural institution have a moral obligation to preserve the damaged art as a part of public memory when the damage represents urgent social injustice. So our path to victory is simple: which side can better advance meaningful social justice movements, right? If we prove that burden to you, we win. Then with that, let me forward two substantive arguments in my speech. Firstly, on activism, and secondly, why is this a valid method to achieve equality? No, Judge, that this becomes a statement for activism, right? Why is this then the only exclusive way to make a difference? Not because it is the only way to make like people to get people talking, right? Because it's the only method that reliably breaks through the public apathy. We tell that people are desensitized with storing news and short attention spans and social media culture. Getting the message across is something that is not easy. Traditional forms of protest, you see petitions, peaceful marches, or like these online campaigns have become normalized and easily ignored. In contrast, this is why we need like our notion and our stance, right? Because these damaging high profile paintings literally forces society to confront their own priorities. It creates moral discomfort. I think it also reframes a society's fixation on preservation of these works, because when society reacts more strongly to a paint on a canvas than to rising sea levels, displaced communities, that itself is moral indictment. And only through this are we creating moral discomfort and forcing them to face this. Because art is meant to be political judge. Historically, art has been used to critique power, to document injustice, and to even reflect societal concerns that people go through on a daily basis. I think by preserving the damage, museums continue this tradition, right? And only through this do you see the art itself evolve from being a static object of admiration sitting in a museum to actually a living site with political meaning, which only aligns with the basic purpose of art, right? To actually create like impact. But then secondly, on the natural progression of history, I think history is not preserved by freezing objects in time. It is also preserved by recording how societies interact with them. Part of historical documentation is to see how art was revered, how it was contested, and why it became something so meaningful for society, right? This is why we think it's actually justified, because at the end of the day, they can still send it to a restoration site after it has received the traction it needs, right? Then why is this more important than preserving the art itself? I think when we're weighing the impacts judge, which loss is actually greater? The loss of pristine aesthetics for like a painting that sits prettily in a museum, or the loss of livable planet that disproportionately harms the most vulnerable? We think that this is the most important delta in this debate that we actually account for on our side, right? But we tell you, judge, that this is the only valid way to achieve equality, because activists target these famous works for a reason, right? It's actually sent a message that society prioritizes the wrong subject. A painting hiding behind bulletproof glass literally gains more traction than climate change, genocide, or systematic collapse. That is the notion that we're actually trying to shift on our side. We think that arts is not meant to be purely on its aesthetics. People go to museums to admire paintings, a painting's beauty, but at the end of the day, it should be able to create meaningful messages. For all those reasons, then, so proud to propose. Thank you.
So throughout the first prop case, they have been trying to compare the value of art to the value of environmental damage or other urgent social injustice. We think that this debate is not artists versus poor people or paintings versus environment, because art already wins on both sides. Not only does this damage display harm art, but it also has no real impact on the so-called immediate issues that they seem to care so much about anyway. As a leader of opposition in today's debate, three things in my speech. Two things in my speech, first recharacterizing the debate and then providing two constructive arguments for the opposition bench, the lack of impact on immediate issues and the harm of the art and the artists. So moving on to recharacterizing the debate and clarifying some things. First, we want to clarify the motion. They talk about how they will have delayed restoration. First of all, in most cases, the restoration of art is very time-based. Even if you don't fix it immediately, further on, it's harder or even impossible to remove the stains and restore the painting. And second of all, even if after many, many years, the artist will successfully restore their art, the harm of this damaged display is already done in the public and cannot be recovered or revoked. So, why are these paintings display was damaged? They say that it's to broadcast a public image, but this is not the same display like a war memorial, right? This painting display is not compensating or apologizing to the artist. No artist will ever feel good about their tainted painting displayed on public, because the sense of humiliation is exemplified. So, in this status quo, this is very important. First of all, we already see a rise in these activists damaging paintings. They're already damaging the paintings in this status quo. But do we see the environmental problem significantly improving? No, obviously not. The environment is getting worse and worse. We have reached a stage where drawing attention and raising awareness is simply not enough. Even if you try to draw attention by making this damage display, this will lead to one of the two results. One, the public will hate on the activists even more for destroying authentic human history, because the primary purpose of public people visiting such museum is to connect with artwork. You're committing vandalism to the stuff that the public enjoy. The people who go to museums are likely people who care about art and culture and artwork, so these people will actually have a more negative view on such environmental activism, right? It will draw attention, but draw negative attention. Two, even if it does draw positive attention, most and audiences are like, oh, wait, these environmental problems are actually quite severe. Does it do anything to actually help environmental progress? Because no, in this status quo, even if many people already knows that environmental problems exist, they don't know what comes next. They don't know how they can help to solve this issue. They don't know what to do. Art believes that the only real and effective way to solve environmental issue is not just drawing attention at this point, because we have failed many times to just raise awareness, but by taking action. So, for example, alternative methods to combat climate issues would be to talk to actual industrial factories and big companies that can actually generate systematic change and persuade these people to switch to renewable resources, clean energy, etc., which is the primary cause of greenhouse gas emissions. We need to summarize a better stage for these activists, and the stage of public people visiting museums is simply not enough. And the key stakeholders first, artists, these people are actually very vulnerable and worth protecting because artists, let's emphasize, are not largely responsible for the environmental harm. They actually consume far less when they're making the artwork than, for example, generating
Wang,
huge amounts of waste like industrial production. Yes, take it.
don't you think that before people have social justice movements and gain critical mass, they need to shift the public priority first?
First of all, we've already shown you that your damage display does not properly raise awareness because it will lead to many people having even more negative emotions towards these environmental problems. And second of all, we know that in the status quo, there are already countless news and discussions about climate change, but there has still been no real progress and impact, right? Okay, moving on to my two substantive points. So, first of all, since they care about these immediate issues so much, the first argument will be the lack of impact of the damage display on motivating actual environmental or poverty change. In this task, why are people not acting? Is it because they don't know the problem exists and that they live in their own bubble? Now, that's not the key problem, right? Why? Especially over the past few decades, on internet, on social media platforms, these content has been filled with climate change related content. There's already a lot of awareness and discussion. That's something that you cannot deny, right? People might be aware of the issue, and they want to solve the awareness issue by letting more people know. But letting people know it's not enough at this point. Behind inaction is systematic issues within people's mindset. For example, people think that climate change is distant, they won't affect them in daily life, and they always think that someone else will come and do it and make the change, right? So, two key questions here. First of all, will it really create a positive public reaction? Will it actually make people feel strongly about environmental action, not just pity the artists, right? So even if the message that you're trying to broadcast is about environmental harm or poverty, if people see the damage painting, not everyone is going to get the same message because there are different interpretations of this damage display. Yes, some people might empathize with these activists, but many people, arguably more than other people, will actually pity the artists. Why? Because the human nature is that they side with the victim, the weaker people, the vulnerable people. When they see the wounds and the taints inflicted on the painting, their intuition is to interpret these as the injuries inflicted on the artists themselves. So they're more likely to empathize and pity and feel protective of the artists, not just this environmental activist. So no matter what the incentive of the damage display was originally, the public message received can actually negatively impact these social movements, right? And second of all, even if there is a positive reaction, is this reaction strong enough, right? It is simply unrealistic for a person to see a damaged painting and go back home and suddenly feel motivated to take out huge amounts of time and money while still having a packed schedule in their daily life, a family to support, and a own life to live into helping poor people or the environment. Because the incentive of that viewing a painting can generate, the emotion that viewing a painting can provoke, is likely for most of the audience very mild and short lasting. It's not even close to being strong enough to outweigh the burden and the difficulty for actually working for these poor people or the environment. What is the impact? The impact is that there is no impact. So yes, people view the painting, but we have proven, first of all, most of the people who move the painting will actually side with the environmental or poverty activist side. Two, these actions are not targeted toward the people most likely and most able to actually generate change. And three, most people won't even care enough to want to make change after seeing the painting. Environmental change requires huge amounts of money and resources, so they should be targeting bigger companies and bigger stakeholders, and this display will not bring huge investment and progress. So on to the second argument, the most direct harm in today's motion, the harm on the quality of artwork and the dignity of the artist. Now this matters. Artwork, even if they're on display, they're already destroyed and tainted. This means that literal parts of the art is being covered up, and they can't deny that. Artists, this means that tremendous time and effort of these artists are going to waste. They feel angry and humiliated, and these emotions are further exemplified when thousands of people are viewing this damage. Why is this harm unique? Because art is unique. Each painting, if left unrestored, is sometimes impossible to replace, or anyways very difficult to replicate with the same authenticity. What is the impact? They might say that the value of art is vague and unimportant in the face of immediate issues. First of all, we've already proven how we win the clash on the environmental side, but we also argue that art itself and the artists have immense value. First of all, in terms of the art is a history and a culture, is an essential part of humanity. They say that history is not just frozen in paintings, but they cannot deny the fact that these artworks are valuable artifacts. If prompt is to simply discard art, this leads to absurd conclusions. They may as well discard all the fossils in the museums and all humanity knowledge, because these humanity knowledge don't save lives, like for example science or engineering. They might say that art has no value, but art is invaluable for future generations, for future historical studies, right? And moving on to the artists are real people. From an ethical perspective, it's unfair for for these artists because the harm inflicted on them is carelessly not receiving any kind of compensation and apology, and they're also wasting time and energy that they could have been using to make more art. For all of the reasons, never proud to oppose. Thank you.
Art has always been inherently political. I don't understand why we would strip art of its ability to forward and send political messaging just because it's pretty, or just because it was painted in the 1700s. I think the current condition of people, with a lot of people having food insecurity, grassroots individuals shouldering the brunt of climate change, like the floods in Jakarta, where grassroots individuals were mostly affected. And I think just this outweighs maintaining pretty art for historical preservation, even if it is, even even if it causes frustration within the public, because that's what we want, controversy. So proud to propose then. Firstly, on the top of my speech, a couple of strategic mistakes and clarification. Firstly, I just don't think that OP is going through the proper avenue through to realize how environmental reparation or just reparation within policies make place. So firstly, art create damaging art with throwing substances on it creates controversy. There's a lot of people talking about that. There's a lot of media coverage. This increases the pressure on the government to actually do something. Yes, these protesters are punished in jail, but there are going to be more protesters later on. There are going to be more people throwing these type of substances on art. The only long-term solution is to actually put an effective policy that will result in some kind of environmental improvement. Secondly, note that controversy does not immediately translate to people hating. I think that this is a bigger burden and a one-liner statement that they mention without proper mechanism or analysis. We tell you that sure, some people will be mad, some people will hate the activists, but the message of these movements will not fade. It will be remembered, and that's what our side stands for. And finally, OP has just not answered their burden. What is your counterfactual? If you don't agree with damaging the paintings, then what is their solution to combat climate change? Just keep it remain and prioritize art over these serious conditions affecting all of us. And so without counterfactual, their case falters. Yes, I'll take that PY. Is that a PY? Sorry, 3, 2, 1, moving on then. On my first clash on artistic and historical value. I think they told you that damage just reduces the artistic value. So I don't think this is necessarily true, and I don't think the art is necessarily ruined. And I actually think we can flip this claim because we actually add historical value to these paintings. For a couple of points then. Firstly, I just don't think this claim is even true. Even when protesters threw soup at the Mona Lisa is a very valuable painting covered by protective bulletproof glass. So firstly, yes, they can keep the glass in there and not actually cause any permanent damage to the painting. But secondly, it can still serve as a political reminder because people generally don't know that the Mona Lisa is covered by glass. They look at the face value of the image, they see the Mona Lisa covered in paint, and they feel frustrated. They feel like they have to talk about it, and it creates more information being spread around, like social media, etc. Secondly, I think art is inherently political. You cannot ignore the political aspect of art because it is pretty. It is created within the context. For example, Van Gogh prided himself on fighting industrial capitalism, expressing his frustration of that through his paintings. Frida Kahlo's paintings were full of political messaging about imperialism. And current society reduces artistic values because they don't actually value art beyond beauty. They take pictures, they post it on their Instagram, but they don't read into what the artist was trying to say. Secondly, art needs to reflect the current people society. In the future, people will have a historical record of the problems during our time through this type of art, through all the splatters and all the imperfections in our art. They will know how the people of our time are reacting, and although sure we lose some kind of historical value because we don't have the perfect physical copy of the art during our present moment, but I think in the long term our future generations have a better record of what was going on in our world and how these people were reacting. Secondly, I think they told you that just artists would not like this. They feel humiliated and people would just pity the artist. So I don't think this is true. I think artists in the first place would agree with this type of political messaging, especially since art was their expression of political rebellion. Think Andy Warhol, think Picasso. Every artist is inherently political. Secondly, a lot of these artists who painted classical paintings died over 300 years ago. I don't think that it's very hard to generate pity for an artist that has passed away over 300 years ago. And I think although they themselves don't catalyze environmental degradation, that we are all affected in it. We are all affected by it, and we all have to play a part in contributing to its improvement. Second clash on effective activism and the social justice movement. Firstly, they told you that the environmental movement in this case would just not be effective, and talking about it is not enough, and the public will just hate activists more. I think, Judge, this argument misunderstands the function of activism. The goal of activism is not to immediately solve climate change because that's impossible, but it is to shift public discourse and force prioritization of an issue. This is literally the prerequisite for them to actually make change. And on that metric, this form of protest succeeds precisely because people cannot stop talking about it. Media coverage, public outrage and engagement, institutional responses, and government statements all follow. And more importantly, no form of activism alone is sufficient, but disruption and radicalization is often the trigger that enables other solutions like policy debate. Public dislike has never been a reliable indicator of ineffective activism. This motion is not about whether these activists are popular, but whether displaying the damage sustains attention and forces reflection. And they told you that like a lot of these people, like spreading information is not effective because people already know about the problem. Yeah, we can concede to that. But having permanent reminders of this on like one of their favorite piece of art forces them to care because it affects them personally in a way that they can see very clearly. Now, moving on to my extension on the radicalization and how radicalization is and disruption is required for activism. For the premise, I think radicalization and disruption just result in reactions and mobilization. Activism is feeble and impactless without actions to disrupt the norm, without making people morally uncomfortable. For some context, I'm just going to maintain that art is political, not because of the intended messaging presented by the artist, but because of the context this art was created in. But in modern day, the people just go to the museum, snap a picture, and move on to the next painting. They don't stop to think about how Van Gogh's painting of potato eaters is a critique of poverty and industrial capitalism. So then, why some analysis then on firstly why is the discomfort needed? Art was originally created to be beautiful because people responded to beauty and stopped to think about whatever political messaging was being sent. But now people just go to museums to take aesthetic photos and they just post it and move on. People don't respond to beauty anymore. They only appreciate art because it's pretty. So art and activism must create discomfort and send an explicit message about political and environmental climate. For example, you see like the artists who throw soup wearing shirts like "Stop Oil Mining." So why do we actually need a permanent reminder? I think people's attention spans today are very short due to social media. Like they can't even hold people accountable properly. They generally just move on, even if someone has already been canceled. They can just come back after rebranding and like still have their platform. But this permanent reminder keeps reminding people, keeps making them uncomfortable, and serves as a permanent reminder and a reflection of our current state. And for all these reasons, I am so proud to propose.
Last time I checked, OP's role in today's debate is not to solve environmental and poverty issues as three debaters for the 8 billion people on the planet. They say that we have not produced an alternative. How dare they expect us to mechanize the solution of an issue that billions of people have worked together to solve and failed for decades? The topic of today's debate is the damage display. As long as we can prove what they are doing is ineffective, we automatically win. One phrase Prop keeps repeating in today's debate: the urgent and unequal environmental issues. One key question in today's debate: is it really worth destroying the authentic art temporarily and permanently, as I will prove later on, destroying public trust and evoking negative feelings, doing nothing but only drawing attention and evoking discussions? A short discussion and will not influence everyone. Op says no. Proud to oppose. As the DLO of today's debate, three things in my speech: rebuttals, extension, and rebuilding if time allows. Firstly, moving on to rebuttals. First thing we find utterly ridiculous is Pop's setup, right? They say that, oh, delaying restoration because they want to delay restoration because these damages are automatically not permanent. But they have first off, they have contradicted themselves by claiming this, right? They say that this will be a permanent reminder of discomfort for people to see artwork forever. And then they say that they will restore it later on. So we don't even know what their setup is. Secondly, they have said this thing that glass will protect the painting, so there will not be a permanent change, right? In the status quo, only paintings like Mona Lisa are glass protected. No, thank you. Because this happened to them before. Once these activists realize that this is protected by glass pane, they will target other paintings, like currently Sunflower by Monet, it's not protected, and they will just target those other paintings. So this is an ongoing problem. No, sorry. This is an ongoing problem that we cannot prevent. Thirdly, this simply cannot be achieved, right? After a certain amount of time, the chemicals in the substances bond. So it is nearly impossible to restore the actual authentic version. If you want to restore something, your only time is to do it now, which is what our side believes in. And by delaying restoration, the museum ceases to be an art institution and becomes a news archive, right? If the public wants to understand the protest, they have the internet, they have these newspapers, they have these social media. The museum's unique comparative advantage is providing access to the physical original piece. And if you put glass panes on it, it would just evoke more public distrust because originally there were no these glass panes, and just because these activists appeared, these paintings had to be protected by these glass panes in order to protect history. When you delay restoration, you destroy the only reason for a museum's existence. This can be done elsewhere, just not the museum, because the museum is an important depiction of human history. Secondly, they say that the meaning of art is diluted and extremely overdated, and environmental issues are more significant to the time frame. They also mentioned something about wealth inequality, on how upper classes go to museums versus lower income communities are more vulnerable to these climate issues. First of all, this is actually an issue helping our point, right? We have told you that most of these rich people going to museums care about art and humanities and are less likely to side the environmental activists. Second of all, most of these activists are still likely from wealthy backgrounds, right? So by damaging this art, they are actually destroying public goods. Art in public museums is the only way these lower income people in that country can access high culture. So in a way, they are also creating this wealth inequality and exploiting lower income people and the most vulnerable people to climate change. Thirdly, what is the cause of climate change? It is not just people not having awareness. People do have awareness, but people do not know how to solve it. So even if you raise awareness, it will not do any significant impact to the urgent problem we are facing now with climate change. Yes, I will take your PI now.
All right, so is op stance just prioritizing art and like beauty over climate change because there are already people trying to solve climate change at the current moment?
Op stance is prioritizing beauty and art, but op stance in another way is proving you guys' solution ineffective. Because even if we don't restore these paintings and we actually raise awareness, it wouldn't do anything to the current status quo. Because in the status quo, people are already educated in schools, in communities, in all kinds of environments that the environment is under pressure. But what we are not doing in the current status quo is taking action. What is the primary cause of these climate change? The greenhouse emissions caused by the industrial factories. So why not talk to them? Let them use renewable resources that will actually help and take action in the status quo. Okay, they also say that the goal of activism is to generate discussion. Firstly, we have shown you and proven through many examples again and again that awareness is simply not enough in this situation. Secondly, yes, awareness is the first step, but we have already achieved the first step as mechanized and never rebutted. At this point, you are just pacing back and forth without moving to the second, third, and fourth steps, which are actually taking action. And thirdly, at this point, it doesn't matter. This contradicts themselves because the first speaker already mentioned that this will solve the urgent problem of climate change. This will not. Discussion is not enough for solving the urgent problem of climate change anymore. Raising awareness will no longer be effective to tell people what they do. Moving on to a quick extension on how we will protect the communicative intent of the artist. Right, the context of this, as already proved, is that if we do not restore these paintings quickly, these damages will become permanent. Artists are still people. They have a legacy, right? Even if they're already dead. Just because they die, we might like opposition. No, proposition is just proving that we probably shouldn't be honoring, for example, Gandhi as well. No, any single dead politician as well, just because that they are dead and their opinions don't matter anymore. The truth is that by expressing those political opinions in their paintings, artists made an impact. And for you to destroy that impact and for you to destroy their work, you are without their consent. You are exploiting the artist and their own legacy. what is the impact of this? The impact is one, you will not have public trust because people will feel pity for these artists. And two, most important impact here, people won't want to make art today or going on because in 21, 26 or something, people will keep on changing the legacies and messages of your art. So your art actually doesn't really make an impact if they impose this policy. Therefore, never prouder to oppose. Thank you.
The Louvre is the most visited museum in the world, but yet people still won't talk about climate change because it does not necessarily influence them directly when oftentimes there's these marginalized people living within these like swamps or these like low-lying areas that are oftentimes impacted by these environmental issues. We tell you that under our side of the house, we amplify the painting's meaning because we tell you that the art now becomes this kind of historical record and a conduit for societal issues that is oftentimes supporting one of the main pillars of art. Art is political. We tell you that under their side of the house, they simply just sanitize it under the guise of like purely of aesthetics and under the guise of cultural heritage, when oftentimes these museums, because they are these like public like institutions, it should serve the people. It should reflect societal issues. It should reflect societal trends, and it should reflect what the people are supporting for, which is the environment. But I think what opposition fails to understand is the power of momentum and the power of tension within the public. We tell you under our side of the house, we sustain it for long enough that we actually raise awareness and actually like propagate and proliferate action in the long run, which is why I'm extremely proud to
Go
propose.
on.
So before moving on to my first clash on the idea of the outcome following this kind of event, and second on the valuation of art, some clarifications and strategic mistakes to finally pave the way for this debate. Three things. Firstly, how does vandalism actually translate into actual change? I think we have made this pretty clear cut. We tell that vandalism propagates the right form of awareness. We're shifting prioritization, and we tell that under our side, we solidify that uncomfortable reality that everyone has to face by sustaining this kind of momentum within society. So even if hate still persists within the society and polarization still exists, and even in our worst case, like everything happens, we still have that momentum and underlying tension that society still has to confront. We've already characterized museums as this kind of like elitist and white spaces where oftentimes they subjugate these like smaller and much less marginalized voices in favor of like maintaining this kind of like cultural heritage as a whole. But when we tell you that these museums are actually conduits for societal issues, they literally reflect what society stands for. Therefore, it is known as a public institution where
Go on.
these like paintings belong to everyone. So done my clarifications. Now moving on to my strategic mistakes. Two things. Firstly, they have ignored the delta of this debate that we have reiterated so much upon, which is the environmental movement. If they did not provide a counterfactual to solving the issue, their case does not fly in the first place. I don't get like why we're still at this stage in time. We're not trying to downplay current environmental movements, but what is your team defending? We literally need a comparative that you guys have barely developed. But also secondly, a lot of their arguments did not come with a likelihood analysis. What is the likelihood that under side opposition they're gonna like gain more like environmental momentum, and why would people still be mad under their side of the house, and how like preserving these like pieces of art will actually proliferate that kind of action that both sides want at the very end of the day. So we tell you that under their side they just provide no mechanization, no analysis to actually bolster their entire case. So done with my clarifications and strategic mistakes, I'll be taking that POI. Okay, three, two, one, resuming my speech. So done with my clarifications. Now moving on to my first clash on the outcome following the event. Now, opposition told you that by leaving paintings damaged, it endangers the cultural heritage, and it's simply under their side, they're gonna carry on this kind of preservation work to ensure that these future generations are able to see it, and how how these museums lose like public support in the long run. Now, why is this untrue? Three things. Firstly, we believe that controversy gains more traction because it is radical. People visit these museums because of what they see on the news. This is the reason why after the Louvre heist, like a lot of these people started visiting the museums to actually understand what is going on and what is the narrative behind this entire heist. But our like second speaker has told you that especially within this kind of attention economy, everyone wants to see controversy. We solidify that change as we send a signal to future generations and the public as of right now that museums are not like these neutral institutions, and we tell you that this is what opposition does not stand for. They literally want these museums to remain elitist, which oftentimes harms the most marginalized, but also secondly does not provide anything to the public. We tell you that under our side, we ensure that these museums are still supportive of these people. But also note that if you follow their mechanization that and like tell and like this whole idea that simply museums can erase or hide damage, we tell you that you risk being out of touch or irrelevant. You're still gonna face this kind of public scrutiny, and we tell you they cannot alleviate it. Under our side, we can actually alleviate this kind of public scrutiny because we tell you that these activists are much less likely to target these museums if these museums are able to actually bring up these uncomfortable conversations. But also thirdly, I think public outrage is rarely permanent under their side of the house. If they just preserve it and sweep it under the rug as if it's nothing, everyone's just gonna go back into their daily lives. So we tell you that the risk of losing support is far smaller, far smaller under our side than like what like opposition told you, and the supposed harm is temporary compared to the enduring like moral benefits that you get under our side. That is simply mutually exclusive under side proposition. So what? So like even so, but let's be charitable and engage with our best case and tell you why it's not enough. Because even if people end up not funding and supporting the activists or like even the museum as a whole due to bad public optics and ratings, the message is still sent through societal narratives. People are still going to talk about it for centuries because that damage is permanent in the painting, and therefore meaning is now reinterpreted because now the painting and the damage is now interdependent, meaning that the meaning is actually amplified. This is not devaluing the artist's work because we've already told you that art is inherently political. It serves as a conduit and a representation of the of like the society of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. So there are contradictions that they claim to protect heritage for the long term, yet their method already erases the idea of historical record because we tell you that activism is an integral factor that plays into this. So that's my first clash. Now moving on to the second case about how it's not gonna just do anything to the issue overall. So they told you this, but we actually would like to contest to this factor due to two reasons. Firstly, opposition has this unruly characterization and assumption that symbolic action is separate from this whole notion of real change. We've already told you this continuously over and over again. That's when these like artists like throw like these substances into the paintings, it literally drives awareness. That is the main reason why they're going into these museums, risking their future to like literally throw these substances is to actually garner much more attention in the long run. So let's just do the weighing once and for all. What do you get under side proposition that they're like mutually exclusive? We tell that under our side, we still like proliferate that momentum and action, and we ensure that long-term change is going to happen under our side. They've never had a comparative, which is why I'm extremely proud to propose. Thank you.
Proposition has been asserting for the whole time that the artist's interests shouldn't be protected just because the vandalism of art can cause attention, even though these artists are totally innocent, which we think are both immoral and unfair. So firstly, moving on to some reframing, they said that we don't have a counterfactual. However, we believe that they simply didn't listen to our speeches. So we already proved alternatives like taking actual action, like influencing bigger industrial companies who are actually contributing to the true climate change to switch to more renewable energy and sources and pushing them to change through social media campaigns that can like also gain a lot of public attention. We think this is so much better because instead of raising false awareness like their side, we're actually targeting the primary cause of this climate change problem, right? So the status quo framed by both us and also the opponent is that the majority of people already know that climate change already exists, but they're uneducated on how to take true action. However, we have to ask the opponent, why will telling them then that even more about like climate change is urgent by disrespecting the art of these artists can actually let them take true action? We want the proposition to answer our question. So now moving on to some rebuttals. Proposition said that art isn't truly damaged because pieces like Mona Lisa are protected by glass, and suggesting that the viewers will simply reflect on the messages instead. However, two layers of responses. Firstly, Mona Lisa is just one example amongst like so many artworks that are not similarly protected. So while famous pieces like Mona Lisa are shielded, there are countless other valuable artworks like Sunflower that lack such protection, right? And even if we say that all of these very famous and very old arts are actually protected by these like glass paints, what will happen? The activists will now target the less known paintings of like maybe poor artists who can't pay so much money for legacy, etc. So they will actually target these arts and damage them. So we think is actually more like unfair for these like poor artists and these famous artists who can actually pay the legacy, right? And secondly, even if the artworks are not permanently damaged due to glass protection, the audience will not connect with the art as intended as the proposition. The thing is that what an artist will see, or what an audience will see is nothing, because they won't see the art anymore, but only a splatter of paint on the glass that covers the art. Instead of what prop claim, the audience will actually stop by the arts and reflect, but what they will do is just not go to museums anymore, because what is their incentive to go to museums is to actually see the famous art itself, but not pure splatters of paint on the glass, right? We think their premise doesn't work in the first place, and what will happen is that people just won't go to museums anymore or think anyway anymore. If museums just start displaying these damaged artworks, people might just choose to avoid going altogether, opting for like better and different entertainment like watching movies, rather than actually inspiring thought like what they claimed. The damage could result in a significant loss of interest in art and culture overall. So now moving on to the clash analysis. First, clash on effectiveness and reputation of this environmental activism. Opposition believes that displaying damaged art, it can evoke a lot of public hate and distrust towards environmental actions and activists. Proposition said that damaging these art is the only way to gain public attention and make a true difference. 3 layers of responses. Firstly, we can say that, okay, damaging this art can attract a lot of public attention, but it is just only negative attention. Instead of inspiring support for environmental or political causes, these actions will only backfire and lead to public outrage among activists. People will view these actors as reckless, irrational, and brutal, leading to increased hostility towards their cause rather than support. And secondly, damaging this art can just create a very dangerous precedent for future activism, because if it becomes like accepted and justified that vandalism is the only effective means to gain public attention, more individuals will feel justified in resorting to similar destructive actions. And it's not only about art anymore, leading to a cycle that harms cultural institutions and heritage. This can lead to ultimately creating more division rather than constructive dialogue about these important issues. So, thirdly, the legal consequences that activists face that a proposition claimed after such actions indicate that this approach did not lead to real change. While the activists may be willing to face the consequences, the status quo of repeated actions of vandalism already show that these legal consequences are not deterring and working. Therefore, this increase in vandalism will only push people to view these activists as criminals rather than advocates for change. And so, therefore, we argue that less but better public attention is more effective than prophesize more but bad public attention. So let's compare the roles of prop in this clash. So what happens on their side? By damaging the art, it doesn't push any environmental actions, because this action of destruction not only isn't justified to directly help the environment, as my previous speakers have proved, but even makes people hate on these environmental activists, because the public will think that these activists are destructive, irrational, and brutal, and they will only care about the environment and themselves at the expense of destroyed cultural heritage. And activism isn't actually focused on awareness and constructive dialogue, but only on damaging cultural heritage. So on our side, however, activists actually focus on meaningful and effective ways of pushing societal change, like setting up campaigns on social media or pushing like big companies to change, because they will realize that they won't actually draw public attention to them because the arts will be restored anyways, but also realize by doing this they're only drawing public hate. And in the long term, they will be like more effective environmental actions and change, because the public will actually become more supportive of these activists and actions. So the only meaning of this activism in this debate is to call for real effective change, but not just like creating destructions all around the world and then they claim that it's only gaining public attention. Prop says that activism isn't immediately making a change because attention is a prerequisite of change. However, we already proved how a prerequisite and foundation of public hate won't make any change that they wanted to. On prop side, however, the true essence of activism is already truly diminished, while on our side we can make true change. So now moving on to the second clash in this debate about art and artist protection. We believe that public attention to environmental activism shouldn't be at the expense of the damage of art, which is a crucial part of human heritage and also artistic expression. So on proposition world, what happens? Artists are actually like creating art with specific intentions, right? Displaying and damaged pieces undermines the original version and integrity of the artwork. Displaying it in a damaged state could misinterpret their intentions and diminish its aesthetic value. And secondly, museums like can't actually protect these art anymore. So the viewers like attention and like their actual experience in the museum is also diminished. So what like their cycle on their side is firstly the famous art gets damaged in museums and continues displayed in the damaged form. Secondly, artists are depressed and furious and have less audience because the audience don't want to see damaged art. And then the artists don't display in public museums anymore because they're scared about their hard work will be ruined. And then there will be less revenue for museums and even less able to recruit people to protect the safety of the arts, and then it continues the cycle again and again. However, on our side, we're restoring the paintings to protect these artists and encouraging them to further create art. So From a moral perspective, we already proved that restoring damaged art is a way to show respect for cultural heritage and artists' efforts. Artists can spend several months or even years on a single artwork. Judge, do you think that it is moral for activists to just destroy them for public attention on environmental issues when these arts probably doesn't even is the reason for global warming? Obviously not, right? Museums and institutions has the moral ability to prove them. Therefore, because what Prab is saying simply, firstly, we shouldn't respect old art because the artists are already dead. Secondly, the present arts of living artists is not reported. While on our side, it's truly moral. Opposition truly wins this clash and also truly wins this debate. Thank you. This debate is beginning to feel extremely one-sided. It's starting to feel like they're not even listening to what we're saying through our 21-minute case. First of all, before I even begin my reply speech, two piece of clarification. One, we feel like we cannot stress this enough. Now, Op's stance is not art over nature and poor people. This debate is not about comparing which is more important, art or immediate issues. So any kind of weighing or comparison that they do on this should automatically be ignored because we avoid harm on both of these issues. We don't care which is more important. Even if they can prove that immediate issues are more important than art or human culture, this does not even give them a single piece of advantage in today's debate. Okay, second clarification. They say that we have no comparative and no counterfactual. First, last time I checked, we don't have the responsibility to solve a global issue, okay? Last time I checked, we don't have to come up with a perfect solution just to prove that their solution is ineffective. Two, we do have a counterfactual. We don't know why they didn't pick this up. Maybe they didn't listen to both our first and second speeches because both speeches actually emphasize this counterfactual. We emphasize and prioritize taking actual action over raising awareness. For example, influencing bigger industrial companies and government policy to switch to more renewable sources and banning, for example, plastics. This is better because instead of raising awareness, we are targeting the primary cause of this entire, for example, climate change or poverty problem. Now, moving on to comparing over art and environmental, both sides. In the LO speech, we'll talk about immediate issues first. So I'll talk about immediate issues first here again. They say that public message is about showing a priority, but what you say does not matter if the right people don't hear. What message that you intend to make does not matter if it's not interpreted the way you want it to be interpreted. In any kind of activism is about the audience you want to get to and persuade the people, A, more likely to want to side with you, and B, the people more likely to make change. So first, are you targeting the right people? The incentive of these people, as we have told you as early as in the first page, which they have never responded to, people who go to museums are more likely than not people who value art and artists' efforts more than, for example, the general public average. So these people are already more likely to care about the art and the artist more. Two, even if you get to the right people, doesn't matter. They say that discussion and controversy is what they want because it generates change. No. Or at least there's a better way of doing it. Capacity. Are these people really able to help? Yes, we agree that richer people go to museums, but there are far larger stakeholders, like entire factories and companies behind these rich people, right? The status quo is that previous successes have all been about government policy success, like banning disposal of plastic. Never have you ever heard of an individual person making a change and suddenly it drives systematic change of the entire issue, right? So to summarize the debate on this environmental/poverty issue, one, we do have a counterfactual. They just didn't choose to listen to our previous speeches. Two, they fail to generate the emotional reaction that they attempt to generate. And three, even if they do generate an emotional reaction, this reaction is not enough to create systematic change, whereas we can generate systematic change in bigger stakeholders like governments and companies. They say that without activism, people are living under a rock or in their own bubble. But even if you can pull them out of the rock and burst their bubble for a couple of seconds or minutes, it does not matter. Now, moving on to the art side, let me stop here for a second to tell you that at this point has been entirely dropped on their side, apart from a piece of self-conflicting setup. The only attempt they have tried to rebut this is that they tell you that, oh, we'll restore these art later on after this play. First of all, we've already told you that this is simply not realistic because if you want to restore art, it's easier to do it immediately. And second of all, they have then told you that this is a permanent reminder of discomfort for the people, so it's contradicting themselves. We don't even get the point of the setup they're trying to make. Yes, we argue that this debate has become more about the immediate issues, but that does not mean the value of art no longer matters. If they say that art has no value, this leads to absurd conclusions. They are using a total utilitarianism mindset. They want to spend every penny on human life, so they may as well just discard all kinds of space exploration, commercialized goods, and entertainment. That's ridiculous. Then they have completely ignored the key stakeholder of artists in today's debate. First of all, the living artists, they're criticized as cool, cold, evil people just because the work they do don't save lives like doctors or engineers do. Let's emphasize that these artists don't generate a lot of climate change. They're innocent and irresponsible people. On the other hand, the harm inflicted on them has not received the compensation and apology they deserve. Instead, it's most ironically used as a tool to advertise for the very people that did that harm to these artists, right? And as for the dead artists, they say that dead artists don't matter. But if they disrespecting these artists' impact and legacy just because they're dead, they may as well dishonor everything that Gandhi, everything that Lincoln, everything that anyone that has ever done to our role in the past. For all these above reasons, never proud to oppose. Thank you.
I think opposition's biggest problem is all the assertions in their speeches. Look, we actually do care about these artists. We'd posit that artists like Banksy, Andy Warhol, etc., would love that their paintings and art are used for political messaging because that's what they've always been trying to portray. They've tried to portray art as inherently political. And they were themselves very vocal about political issues. But in our worst case scenario, we can't guarantee that they would be happy, and at the same time, side opposition can't guarantee that they'd be upset either. And I think OP has just been extremely uncharitable when they're referring to us. Judge, never have any of Prop's speakers that artists were immoral or unimportant because they don't save lives like doctors. And they told you that we didn't listen to their speeches, but I think that these assertions just show that they are either embellishing our own speeches or not listening to them at all. Now, moving on to strategic mistakes, firstly, I think that there are just generally a lot of contradictions in their speeches. DLO and reply speaker question why we even had the temerity to push the burden of improving the current climate on them. But then opposition whip said they had that counterfactual that they are offering this solution. Even then, I think op whip solution will lead nowhere because of how most of these big corporations have policies that are in favor of them instead of the environment. And secondly, they ignored our entire analysis as to how controversial acts such as damaging artworks propagate action. That momentum is what eventually leads to societal transformation. And under their side, it's only within the educational system. And finally, Prop never said we shouldn't honor artists who have already passed away. We just said that it's very difficult to generate empathy and pity for someone who passed away over 300 years ago, whose personality we don't even know. But to note that the majority of modern artists are inherently political. They literally sanitize it. They follow these elitist narratives. Now, moving on to my clashes, firstly on the effectivity of activism. We posited that the importance of damaging art by throwing paint at it is to create controversy. Even in our worst case scenario, people are mad, people are still talking about it, media coverage is there, incentivizing institutional response, thwarting elitism because it forces the bourgeois to confront this harrowing reality and it raises visibility. Their response is that people will just be mad and hate these climate activists. I don't think this is enough because I think people are just not dumb. I think people will realize the long-term solution to having their art preserved is some kind of pro-environment policy being passed and these activists being satisfied. But they told you that our side erodes public trust, that people pity artists and instead of these activists, and people already know about the climate issues. I don't think this is enough because sure, their claims are true to a certain extent, but I don't think they're actually applicable here. I mean, yes, people already know about the climate issues because they've been taught about it in school. It's been proliferated all around social media, but people literally just don't really care because they don't see the direct impact to their lives. My first speaker already told you that people are more desensitized without something that provides moral discomfort. The attention would just not be there, and opposition needs to understand whether the response is good or bad. We need that. Controversial talk is better than no talk at all. They don't correlate, they don't realize this. And we win this clash, I think, because the likelihood of our case is stronger. People have talked about the Mona Lisa having paint thrown at it. People know it's climate activists who do so. What people don't know in this situation was pity Leonardo da Vinci. I think we just acknowledge more realistic scenarios. Then, moving on to my second clash on disregarding artistic property. I think we posited that we told you that art is inherently political, and it's also part of the natural progression of humans that art can be damaged, because history is supposed to document people's interaction with things. And in this case, we think this is more important, that the purpose of art is to interact, not to sit prettily in a museum, but to create grassroots changes. Their response was that they basically told you they prioritize art over frivolous beauty over climate change because there are other people trying to solve the state of the climate. But they told you on their case that they have a counterfactual already of targeting big corporations and people just go to museums to care about art, and that under our side we devalue the arts. I think that firstly, art has just been extremely commodified where people just go to museums to take photos. And secondly, that there are government incentives and initiatives occur under both sides is extremely commodified on both sides. So our case is more important because opposition frames this debate around aesthetic harm, artist feelings, or temporary outrage. These are narrow, surface level concerns. And for all these reasons, I'm so proud to propose. Thank you.